Okay, so today I'm going to introduce you to Martin Buber. Here is the outline of our class today. So first, biography. Yes, and second, let me make sure everyone is muted. Okay. So second, the influence of Hasidism. We'll talk about that. 3, I and thou, and we'll talk about that also. Okay, so that's the plan for today. All right, so here are the dates of Buber, 1878 to 1965. So now, again, we are going to be traveling. We were north in Denmark, and we go back, actually, not to Germany, but Austria. Although Buber will teach a little bit in Germany too, but he was born in Austria. So we're right next to Germany. We're back down to Western Europe. And of course, we're traveling in time a little bit, about 100 years. So here we are with Martin Buber. So I'll tell you a few things about his life before we get into his thought. So he's a Jewish philosopher. He was born in Vienna, in Austria, to a very Orthodox Jewish family. His grandfather, actually, Solomon Buber, was a very well-known Jewish scholar, right? So he was a rabbi, he was a teacher, he had students over all day long, a library in his house, and Buber used to spend most of his time actually with his grandfather. So this is important because we're going to see the influences of Judaism in Buber's thought today. Buber obviously is a philosopher. He's influenced by a lot of the Western thinkers, but there's also a strong strand of Judaism in his work. Similarly to when we studied Sufism, right? We had different influences coming into Rumi's thought. So this is the same, right? Buber has kind of two influences that are kind of entering and mingling. You have the influence of Judaism and the influence of Western philosophy. So he spent a lot of time with his grandfather. He kind of, heard a lot of the stories of the teachings of Judaism, read a lot of the books. But when he was a teenager, he had a kind of existential crisis, and he kind of felt like, Judaism is not for me. I don't feel connected to this faith. And he kind of broke off with Judaism. And then he turned in his teenage years to philosophy, right? And he read a few of the people we've read, so that's nice. He read Kant, whom we know. He read Kierkegaard, whom we also know. And he read Nietzsche, whom some of you might know, right? So you can sense when you read Buber, there is a strong influence, right, of these guys, especially Kant. Today I'm actually going to explain some of the Buberian concepts using Kantian terminology. We're going to go back to Kant to explain Buber because they're so connected, right? Buber is a Jewish Kant, you could say. Okay. So after a while, reading Western philosophy, Buber discovers a branch of Judaism called Hasidism. And now Hasidism is to Judaism what Sufism was to Islam. Okay, so if you want to really get a sense of what Hasidism is, it's the same type of movement as Sufism, same idea. It's a mystical branch of Judaism, just like Sufism was a mystical branch of Islam, and they're actually fighting pretty much the same battle, right? If you remember, Sufism was saying Islam has become too legalistic, we're too focused on the text, we're not focused enough on the heart, right? Remember the story I told you with the old man who burns the books and then just fire remains, right? An invitation for Rumi to follow his heart. Hasidism is doing the same thing, but in Judaism, right? So they're saying Judaism has become too legalistic, too focused on the text, on the elements of the law, and we have forgotten, right, the heart, right? So Hasidism really emphasizes it. In fact, there's several stories. The Hasidim were very interesting rabbis, right? They were mostly in Eastern Europe. Right, this was a movement that grew out of Eastern Europe, and of course, Germany's on the border with that. So they had such a different way of teaching, right? They're so, if any of you want to get a good introduction to Judaism, I would start with Hasidism, right? So they would actually, because they were so interested in bringing Judaism down, to the level of the heart, they actually taught in stories. They didn't have, the same approach to Judaism where you have to be, really well versed in the Talmud and know Hebrew and Aramaic, but they wanted to reach the common people. So they really taught Judaism in the form of stories. And just to give you an idea of this return to the heart, right, versus the mind, same that we see in Sufism, there's a beautiful story told by one of those Hasidic masters, and I'll tell it to you right now. So this is a story of a man who was very ignorant, right? He was a peasant, he had no education, he didn't know anything. And he was worried as a Jew that he couldn't pray, he couldn't join in the prayers of the synagogue, which are all in Hebrew, right? If you go to a synagogue even today, they don't pray in English. They have a prayer book in Hebrew. If you don't know Hebrew, you're screwed. You can't pray, right? So this guy was very ignorant. He didn't have time to study. He was working the land all day long, and all he knew was the alphabet. Didn't know Hebrew. So he comes to the rabbi, Hasidic rabbi, and he says, I'm so worried, I can't pray, I don't know Hebrew. And the rabbi asks him, well, what do you know? He says, well, I know the alphabet. And he says, well, okay, next time you're in the synagogue, this is what I want you to do. Just sit there and recite the alphabet. And the angels will come and will put these letters together for you and formulate the prayers for you, right? So you don't need the Hebrew, just the heart. Recite the alphabet with devotion, and it is the angels themselves which will compose the prayers for you, right? So this is just, and you see how similar to Sufism, right? Sufism also telling stories, right? So this is a story just to illustrate that, we're seeing a shift, right? The Hasidim are trying to create a shift between an overly intellectual religion that Judaism had become to a movement of the heart, right? So that's just an example. So that's one of the main shifts of Hasidism, right? From same as Sufism, from the emphasis on the text, the law, to simply the feelings, the heart, right? And for the Hasidim, actually, if your heart was in the right place, you didn't need any of those things. You didn't need to know Hebrew, you didn't need to know the law, you didn't even need to open the Bible. If your heart was in the right place, you were already there, they believed. I'll tell you another story. These are great stories. Actually, the reason I'm telling you all these Hasidic stories is that Martin Buber, he wrote a book actually called Gog and Magog. I'm writing it down here in the chat. It's not one of his best works, but in that he's not a good novelist, to be honest. But in that work, he tells a lot of the Hasidic stories. That's where I'm getting some of these stories, right, from that book. So here's another story that he tells about the importance of where the heart is, right? So this is a story of a rabbi who had a friend who was, he was best friends, and everybody was, embarrassed, about this friendship. This rabbi was the best friends with what would be today, I don't know, the main drug dealer of the city, or I don't know, what is the worst person? Somebody tell me, what is the worst criminal figure right now? What would you call them? Drug dealer is too mild. Anybody know? Help me out here. Felon, not a felon, but somebody, who's like like Al Capone in Chicago, you know what I mean? Was there somebody like Al Capone here in New York? Do you know Al Capone? Yeah, like a mobster, yeah. Is there any famous name here that comes up for a New York mobster? No, not him, not Bernie Madoff, no. No, somebody noble. Wasn't there a movie came out? Anyways, a mobster. No, not Trump. No, you guys are getting it all wrong. Trump doesn't have the dignity of the mobster. So this was the principal mobster of the town, right? And this rabbi was best friends with this guy. They would hang out in the tavern and drink together and tell jokes. And the students of the rabbi were so embarrassed about this situation. They would try to cover it up. And when people would ask, they'd be like, no, you imagined, right? And one day the students came to the rabbi and said, Rabbi, why are you hanging out with this guy, right? He's a criminal. He's not your level. And the rabbi said, it's just that I enjoy him so much. And here's what, this guy is always happy. Each time I see him, he's cracking up, making jokes. He's always happy, right? Even though he just killed someone the night before, he will come and we will have the best time. He tells the best jokes. He has the most contagious laugh. And I love this guy's joy. And the students are like, well, that's not enough, Rabbi, right? He needs to have moral fiber and, an intellect. And the rabbi is like, no, this man is way ahead of us because he has found what we are working towards. Why we study these texts, why we pray, why we keep the commandments, in order to access the level of joy in our heart. That is the highest spiritual level. And this guy, he has it naturally. And so I spend all this time with him to learn from him, right? So very powerful story, right? Where he's basically saying, even if you're a mobster, if you have reached a level of joy, you are on a higher level spiritually than the rabbi spending all day in the scriptures, right? So really the idea here is that if your heart has reached a certain level, you don't need the rest, because the rest is only there to bring you to that level. Same idea in Sufism. Remember, in Sufism, if you've reached love, right, you don't need anything else. You're now able to enter the palace, right? So it's the same idea that the state of the heart is really what is telling when it comes to the spiritual level. It's not your knowledge, it's not your perfection, it's not your moral purity. How happy are you, right? And if you're happy, you're there. You're way beyond everybody, right? Okay, so that's just another story, right? So second idea in Hasidism, so make sure you write this first idea, right? This notion of what matters is not so much the mind, but the heart, right? And the notion of relationship with God versus just, obedience. So that was the other thing, right? The Hasidim want to emphasize the relational, the basic level of relation, right? You don't need to do all these complicated things. If your heart is connecting, you're there, right? Even if you don't know Hebrew and so forth. So joy is a way to connect. Praying with devotion, with the alphabet, is a way to connect, right? You don't need all this other stuff. If you're connected to God, which is evident through your joy or your devotion, you have it, right? Okay, so that's the first thing. So second thing that's important with Hasidism is a notion, so this is a criticism that Hasidim had against traditional Judaism, is that Judaism had little by little separated itself from the world. And you see this, right? You see villages or neighborhoods entirely Jewish, right? No contact with the outside world. And this was happening more and more in Eastern Europe, where the Hasidim were living. And of course, there are some historical reasons for this, right? There's a very strong culture of anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe, which was, of course, at the time, and also Russia, right? So this whole area, Lithuania, Ukraine, Romania, and Russia, this is all where Hasidism is sprouting, right? But there was really also a strong culture of anti-Semitism there. So the Jews kind of recoiled on themselves, right? They preferred to live among each other. But when they start to do that, there's also the notion that there's the mentality that arose out of that necessity that, oh, we are pure and these guys are the pagans over there and we shouldn't have any dealings with them because that will make us impure, right? So along with the necessary separation came this kind of mentality that this is good that we're separate. It's good because we maintain our purity and we don't have to touch these, uncircumcised pagans out there. So there was kind of the mentality that, we don't want to have too many dealings with them because they will corrupt us, right? And the Hasidim were reacting against that, right? For them, the world was as important as, in other words, the profane was as important as the holy, right? So there's the holy nation of Israel, there's the profane nations of the world. And for the Hasidim, we need to stop making a distinction between the holy and the profane, right? What I mean by profane is simply not religious, right? The nations surrounding the Jews, right? The ordinary, right? Ordinary life. And then the sacred, right? Of course, I mean religious, right? the Jews, right? And of course, the spiritual life of the synagogue, and so forth, right? So these are the two dimensions of reality as traditional Judaism delimits them, right? For traditional Judaism, there's the holy people of Israel, the holy place of the synagogue, and then everything else is the profane. It's not important, right? It's inferior. And the Hasidim said, no, we need to stop making these distinctions, because for the Hasidim, everything is holy. The holy obviously is holy, but also the profane contains holiness, because for the Hasidim, God is everywhere, right? God is not just here with the Jews and in the synagogue. God is also with the nations, can also be found in the street, can also be found in the cities of Kiev, St. Petersburg, and so forth. You can find God, right? So this is very interesting, because the Hasidim would say, actually, and this is another kind of story they tell. I can't get enough of these stories. Another story they tell is that there's a saying in Hasidism that whatever you choose to do, and this could be something very trivial, like being, an accountant or mathematician or, garbage man, whatever you choose to do, they said, if you do it with all your heart and with passion, you will find God. Right? So you don't have to be in the synagogue studying for hours, right? The Torah. You can actually choose any discipline that you want. You can be a dancer, you can be a husband, you can be a beggar. You can even, I wonder sometimes, right? You can be maybe a criminal. Anything you do with passion, they said, will lead you to God, because what leads us to God is passion. Same idea as in Sufism, right? So they had this idea, right? So it's a very powerful notion that whatever you choose to do, if you do it with all your heart, you are going to reach the divine. So that was just another way to say, everything is holy, not just this activity or this group of people. Okay, so now you're getting an idea, right? So these are the stories that have nourished Buber, and you find, they have deeply influenced his work. And if you want to read more of these stories, I would suggest Gog and Magog, the novel he writes. And to be honest, not a great novelist, but great stories. I think Buber also published some stories. He translated some Hasidic stories. But in Gog and Magog, I don't know, I like those stories in there better. Okay, so this is the first, right, powerful influence. So Buber, after having read these stories and explored the works of the Hasidim, returns, right, to Judaism, and he will then dedicate his life. I think he did a translation of the Bible. He was doing a number of things for the Jewish community, as well as being a philosopher. Okay, so coming from this, right, you will see in Buber two things in his philosophy, right, from the influence of Hasidism. You will see, first of all, in Buber, an emphasis on relationship, right? Buber is really out to salvage our relationships, which he thinks have lost their, how should I put it? We've lost the sacred character of relationships. So the notion of the sacred is very present in Buber. So you have to be familiar with that, right? Yes, right? So we've lost the essence of relationship. We've lost the element of holiness in the interhuman relationship. And so his main purpose in I and Thou is to help us awaken again to the fact that relationships with human beings are sacred, and that human beings are sacred. They're not just objects that we can use. Now you should be seeing Kant already, right? I'm going to talk more about that. Remember, Kant was saying, right, a human being has dignity, cannot be used like a pencil or a phone, right? Same idea. Buber is going to say a human being is holy, right? Set apart. You can't just use a human being like any random object. Same idea we're going to see. So that's the first thing, right? Emphasis on relationship, rediscovering the holiness of the human beings, of the relationship itself. And the other emphasis in his philosophy has to do with holiness entering the world. In other words, Buber actually wrote a lot of political essays, because for him, Judaism was not supposed to be just something you do on Saturday in the synagogue. Was supposed to be something which permeates political life, right? So he wrote a number of really interesting essays once he moved back to Israel. We'll talk about that in a second. He wrote a number of very beautiful essays on Zionism, right? And this is a very different perspective than what you have today in the present day Israel, right? Buber was all about the state of Israel being a nation of ideals, right? It was what would make the state Jewish would be the Jewish worldview, not so much the Jewish ethnicity, right? So this is important because nowadays we have a debate in Israel about, you know, how many Ethiopians we can let in, how many Russians we can let in, because we want Arabs, right, Palestinians, because we want the state to remain ethnically Jewish, right? And Buber actually was wary, careful when you talk in these ways, right? And he preferred to have a state founded on Jewish values rather than founded on Jewish ethnicity, right? So this is very interesting. So he writes actually about this. So this is, if any of you is interested in Zionism and you want to go deeper and have a different perspective, Zionism has been really criticized last few years, right? It has been even assimilated with National Socialism, with the racist ideology of Hitler. I mean, people are writing, it's unbelievable, right? People are making connections between the ideology of Zionism and the racist ideology of Hitler. And to be honest, there's some points of comparison that you can make, although it's not the same thing at all, right? But it has been really criticized in the last few years, right? The emphasis on ethnic purity, right, of the state of Israel, which is happening right now, is reminiscent of the emphasis on ethnic purity in Germany. So there's been a lot of criticism. And if you read the Buberian essays on Zionism, you will get a whole different perspective, right? And a different way to apply Zionism. So this is just a little bit of a parenthesis for those of you who are interested in Israeli politics. He is a really interesting read. All of his essays on Zionism are really good. Okay, back to his biography. So after his, revival, Jewish revival, he goes and studies philosophy in Vienna. So he does focus on philosophy. In 1923, he writes I and Thou. I'm going back and forth, I and Thou, I and You, because translations, right, vary. So bear with me. And then in 1930, he becomes a professor of philosophy in Frankfurt. Now, anybody tell me where Frankfurt is? And 1930, what's going on?
Germany and the Holocaust.
Very good, right? Holocaust, not yet, but right? Frankfurt is in Germany. 1930 is 3 years before Hitler comes to power, right? So you can already see what's going to happen, right? So he has this position only 3 years, I think. No, a little later. It stays a little long. He has it until 1938. By that time, Hitler has grown very powerful. They are actually at the time in Germany getting rid of, anti-Semitism is at its peak. And of course, anyone who is Jewish is called to step down from academic positions. You have a number of prominent philosophers who had to do so, because they were either Jewish or connected to Judaism. Husserl, Jaspers, and of course, Buber are all called to stand down. So he smartly, intelligently leaves the country. He gets a sense of where things are going and he moves to Jerusalem, where he teaches until his death, right, at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So that's a little bit his intellectual journey. Okay, let's get into his thought a little more deeply. We'll go also into some of the strange concepts that you'll encounter. Let's see, Hakimian. You mean, did Buber at any point renounce his religion? You mean like forget about, like give it up? Is that what you're asking? Yeah, so early, right? When he was a teenager, he renounced it for a few years. And then through Hasidism, he came back, right? Okay. No, after that, of course, he was, doing a lot in terms of developing Jewish education. He's done a lot for that. He's translated also done a new translation of the Hebrew Bible with the philosopher Rosenzweig. So he was very much involved, wrote these essays on Zionism. Yeah, so he was very much involved in Judaism still. Okay, I and Thou. Let's talk a little bit about that text. So first of all, let's talk about the funny terminology you or thou. What do we have on the cover here? What does our book say? Anybody know? I don't have a book with me. Does it say I and you or I and thou? Nobody knows because nobody bought the book. I think it says I and thou. Okay, so let's talk about why he used the word thou, what it means. We have to go back to the German for that. So short German lesson. Those who know Spanish and French in the class, you will understand this well, because in these three languages and others, you have two ways of addressing somebody. You have informal and formal, right? So if you address a friend, it's informal. If you address an adult or someone older or respectable, it's formal. So for example, in Spanish, you have tú and usted, right? French, you have tu and vous. And then in German, you have du and, oh my gosh, sie. Whew, okay, forgetting my German. Okay, so du is informal and sie is formal, right? So what's interesting is that Buber chooses to talk about the relationship with the other. And by the way, there's a parallel thing going on in the whole book that we're going to read, because whatever he's saying about the relationship with the other human being also applies to the relationship with God, right? So when he says du, he's saying I'm addressing the other as someone who is informal, right? It's interesting. So this is an informal, very intimate relationship he's trying to describe. And it's interesting that he addresses God, therefore, right? Because remember, the whole relationship he's describing applies to human beings and to God. So by the way, if you want to, you can also think about what Buber is saying with regards to the relationship with the divine, but we'll cover only the horizontal, the relationship with human beings. So what he's describing then is not a relationship with someone distant, you know, someone who is up there, formal. He's describing a very intimate, close relationship. And for him, we have forgotten how to relate in such an intimate and close way with each other. We relate to each other just now as sie, formal, right? Over there, you over there, right? We have lost the ability of the you close to me. And that's part of what the title means, right? I and thou. Thou, remember, is the English for informal, right? We don't know that anymore. We think thou is formal. It's informal in the Old English, right? So did anybody understand what I just, I feel like I've been rambling about this. Are you getting this, what I'm saying? I feel like I've gone too complicated. Put your hand if you understood what I said. No hand? Everybody's confused? Oh, okay. Thank you. All right. So I feel like I've gone too long on this terminology. Okay, back to I and Thou, the book. Where was I? Okay, so here's what Buber is responding to. He's responding actually to the political situation. So he's one of the rare philosophers, but faithful to the existentialist tradition. Remember, we talked about existentialism, that existentialism is about the here and the now. It's about what is and not what should be, right? Like Kant. Existentialism is about existence. Now, the physical world, the material world, the political world, right? So Buber is very true to his existentialist tradition when he starts thinking from a political situation. He's not thinking over there in his library, in this ivory tower. He's living a political reality, and this is prompting him to write the book, right? Now, what is this political reality? In essence, it's this. Buber is reacting to what we have called the rise of materialism. Let me write this down. In other words, and it starts already with Nietzsche, right? And we saw this a little bit with modernity, with Kant, how little by little, Europe especially has been shedding its religious, connections. We saw this with Kant. Remember, Kant is wanting to just focus on natural moral law. We don't need the scriptures or anything. So as Europe is shedding its religious connections or religious traditions, nothing comes to replace it, right? And so Europeans are stripping themselves of whatever spirituality they had, and they're now replacing it with something else. And so we are now in a world where mystery has been set aside, and we end up in a strictly material world, right? So this is one of the problems, right, of modernity. one of the consequences of modernity, when modernity says we need to leave behind religion and, you know, do our own thing, that's fine, right? But you need to find something to replace the spiritual vacuum that is left behind once you have thrown away religion, right? I'm fine with throwing away religion, but you have to replace it, right? So this has not been done. Science came up and took over, right? And science, except maybe now it's a little more sensitive to mystery, but in general, we are left with pure matter, right? And so this is affecting the mentalities. And so what Buber is noticing is that because we are sinking more and more into a materialistic point of view, we are seeing everything as objects that we can use. We have lost a sense that there's something higher that I cannot control. Let me say that again, right? Sinking into a materialist worldview means this: there is now nothing that is beyond me. Everything is within my reach and I can take anything I want, right? The spiritual realm was the realm that I can't penetrate, I can't possess, I can't understand. This is mysterious. This is, right? This is the divine. And there was a limit to what the human being could take and possess and master. There was always a limit, which was the limit of the gods, right? God or God, right? So now you take this out and now you're left with pure matter. Well, now there's no more limit. I can do what I want. Take this, take that, throw this away, distort this, throw this here, cut this up, right? And so we are, in a way, when we have tossed God aside, we have also tossed aside the dimension of mystery, sacredness, holiness. What do I mean by holiness? Let me explain, because I'm going to use that word a lot. Sacredness, the sacred, right? This is simply the dimension that I cannot possess, control, master, right? That's what I mean by a holy space or a sacred space. This is a space normally inhabited by the divine, right? That I can't enter, I can't take over, right? So once you get rid of the divine, you get rid of that sacred space. Nothing is sacred anymore. Nothing is holy anymore. I can do what I want. And this is where we are at the beginning of the 20th century when Buber is starting to write. We are in a place where there is no limits to human greed and to human power, right? And this is a symptom of a society which has sunk into materialism. Okay, let me say that again. The society of Buber at the time, and still today, by the way, there are no limits to greed or to power, right? Why? Because the sacred has been forgotten, right? And the sacred, of course, used to be the dimension that God inhabited. We throw this away, we get rid of the sacred. Now there's no limit to what I can take and control, right? And what Buber is seeing is that with the demise of religion, with the demise of the sacred, we human beings now have no limits set on their greed and on their power. And this is what we are seeing politically at the beginning of the 20th century up until today, right? We are seeing the overexploitation of human beings. We're seeing multi-billionaires building their empires on the backs of their workers. We are seeing a loss of sense of the sacredness of human life with the military, right? The exponential growth of the military. We are seeing the mind control of totalitarian regimes, right? So three things, right? Totalitarian regimes. We have several at the time of Buber, right? This is mind control, meaning this is the desire to control humans, right? Then we're seeing the growth of the military. Again, right? There's no sense of the sacredness of human life is being lost. Who cares? We're going to conquer this, no matter how many people die. And you have, of course, the exploitation of workers. Again, right, in order to feed the greed, the limitless greed of the corporations or whoever is in charge of the whatever. Okay, so you see these three aspects, right? Politically, totalitarian regimes are sprouting everywhere. You have the Stalinism in Russia, you have Hitler coming to power in Germany, you have Mussolini in Italy. And so this is a trend, right? And these regimes are all about control, right? In other words, they're all about unlimited power. Human beings in those regimes are not allowed to think. They're not even allowed to create, right? So this is where we are, right? There is a desire to no more dimension, right? Sacred dimension that I cannot. This is a desire to control everything, including the mind of the people. There's a funny story, which people don't appreciate so much because you don't know this guy and you haven't heard his music, but I'm going to tell the story anyways. I think I have time. Yes. This is a story of a composer. I never know how to write his name. Shostakovich. This is a composer during the time of Stalin. How many of you know this composer, by the way? Shostakovich. Anybody? I know, I knew it. So this guy, very famous composer of the 20th century, orchestral composer, right? He composes orchestral music for orchestras, right? So he's living under the time of Stalin, and he's an artist, he's a composer. And because he's living under the time of Stalin, he develops panic attacks and anxieties, the composer, not Stalin. And so when he's composing, his music is full of anxiety and nervousness and just doom. You just sense doom in his in his music, because this was the time, right? Stalin, remember, was destroying the intellectual life. I mean, all the intellectuals were being exiled to prison camps. Anybody who was not falling in line would be executed or exiled. Yes, Hakimian, his Fifth Symphony, I'm coming to it, right? So Shostakovich is, feeling threatened all day long for being an intellectual. And he's composing this very anxious, dreary music. And one day Stalin calls him over and he's like, why are you composing this depressing music? You're depressing the people. I can't make them be, they don't work good under those conditions. They're not productive when they listen to this kind of music. And he orders him to compose something better, happier, more upbeat. Shostakovich goes home even more nervous. Now he has to compose something upbeat and he feels like dying. So he actually composes a parody. A parody is like he's making fun. He composes an upbeat piece, but it's an upbeat piece which is kind of making fun of Stalin throughout the piece. So for example, he composes a war symphony in honor of Stalin's conquests, right? So he thinks probably Stalin will like that. But if you listen to it, if you listen to any of the war symphonies, there are several, right, that he composed for Stalin. There is in this piece of music, there is a constant, he's making fun of Stalin throughout the whole musical piece. I'll give you an example. So he starts out with like some trumpets, da-da-da-da-da, right, for the might and power of Stalin. And then in the middle of the da-da-da-da-da, you have a violin going da-da-da-da-da, kind of like dropping. Right? And so you have these anti-climaxes throughout the piece. And if you have a twisted mind, you see what I'm saying already, right? And so he's composing this kind of anticlimactic piece, right? The whole time poking fun at Stalin, saying you're not as masculine or manly as you think you are, right? So that's the idea. So this is just to give you an example of how Stalin wanted to even control the creativity, the intellect, right? When there's no more sacred dimension and unlimited power, we are in the place that Buber is writing in, right? This is first element, right? The totalitarian regimes, mind control. And then of course you have the increase of military, right? You have World War I, World War II, this kind of pointless expenditure of human life, right? This kind of going to war for anything, right? And which now Europe has learned its lessons, trying not to do that anymore, right? We haven't. We're still loving it, right? We haven't yet, as a country, we're savages, really. We love war, clearly, right? So, but in Europe, because of what they endured, right? See, Europeans had war on their own soil. They didn't go and do war on other people's soil. So they have experienced firsthand what is war. And so they're very, very careful. So this was a second feature, right, of Buber's times, is this endless wars. And then the third was, of course, the exploitation of workers, the greed, right? Which doesn't stop. I want more and more, and I will suck you dry until, you fall dead, and I'm at least going to make a profit from your, from your work, right? So this is, and by the way, we are still in the same place today. So I and thou is very much relevant to us, right? We have also high military culture, right? We are selling weapons throughout the cosmos. We are engaged in multiple wars at once, right? Totalitarian, maybe not as much, right? Not yet in this country, right? We still have freedom of expression, freedom of thought, but we have this military culture and we have this exploitation, right? So there's no limits to greed in this country, no limits, right? So this is one of the problems. So Buber is saying, in this kind of culture, we are losing the sense of something that we cannot take over. We are losing the sense of the sacred and the holy, and we're losing the sense of the sacredness of another human being, because we think we can just take that and possess it and use it, right? You should be hearing Kant, right? Okay, so what Buber is going to attempt to do is really help us re-inject into the materialistic atmosphere the dimension of the spirit. And when Buber talks a lot about the life of the spirit. Now, of course, what he means by spirit is not, the Holy Spirit of Christianity. He means simply the element of soulfulness that we are losing, the spiritual element, which doesn't have to be religious, right? But the spiritual part of ourselves, he's trying to re-inject into the culture through this book, right? So I and thou is really, it's a lesson, right? It's a pedagogy. It's meant to help us relearn what it means to interact with a human being who is sacred ground. Okay, let me say that again so you can write it down. So let me type it here, right? So I and thou is meant to help us relearn, right, what it is to interact with a human being as sacred ground and not as someone that I can just take or use for my own benefits, right? With my overwhelming will to power or my overwhelming greed, right? I'm stopped. How do you relate to a human being in this way that you protect the sacredness of that human being, protected from your greed and protected from your power, right? Will to power. So that's really the essence of the work, right? So when you see, so now going into the terminology, right? There are three main concepts. There's the I thou or the I you. This is the same thing, right? There's the I it, and then there's the I. So if you understand these three concepts, you will navigate Buber very easily. So the I thou is simply this. It is a way of relating with another human being as sacred ground. The thou means that you're relating to them as a person and not as an it or an object. Okay, let me say that again. To relate to someone as a thou or as a you means you're relating to them as a person, meaning as a holy entity, as a sacred dimension that you can't just appropriate. In other words, you're connecting to them in a way that is very different than connecting to an object, which Buber calls the I-it, right? So the I-it relationship is me connecting, or the I, connecting to an it, to an object. So most of our relationships throughout the day are with it. You have a bowl of cereal, you're writing something, you're taking your phone, you're wandering around with your computer, you're buying some food, you're reading a book, you're seeing a movie. This is I-it relationships. You're consuming, taking, appropriating. But Buber is saying we are now treating everything like an I-it. I see a person I find attractive, I'm just gonna, swipe swipe left, and I got them for an evening, right? You can even order them online now, people. Brides, I think, yeah, well, for a long time now. It's not new, right? So even in our, by the way, in our dating culture, right, the Tinder culture, this is again another way to see another human being like an it. Oh, I'm lonely, let me check out my Tinder account, see who I find attractive, boom, I swipe left, oh, they like me too, all right, we good. Right? So again, you're like it's a way for you to, I need something, I'm just gonna get it, or shop for it, right? So shopping for relationships. I have here, everybody's there, sitting there in their little, what do you call it? Like the shopping windows, you know, those windows when you go window shopping, same thing, right? And then you can just take someone for the evening, right? So no strings attached. This is the same idea, right? So Buber is saying most of our relationships are I-it relationships, and we have fallen so low as to the fact that, and so that even our human relationships have become I-it relationships, right? We are mostly involved with human beings in order to take something from them, right? So he says we need to recover the art, the ancient and lost art of connecting to a human being as a you. We have forgotten this, right? Now, you should already be hearing Kant's voice very loud in your head, right? Kant was saying the same thing. He was saying we need to stop treating each other like means to an end, but as ends, right? We need to relate to human beings differently than we relate to objects. Objects are means to an end. I can use, I can discard, not human beings, right? So very similar to Kant. Now, Buber is going to go much deeper than Kant in describing the relationship with a human being, because all that Kant did was to be with it, was to say, to be with a human being means you don't use them. And he stops there, right? That's already a big step, right? But Kant just stops by saying the dignity of a human being resides in the fact that I cannot use them. Buber is going to develop much more deeply what it means to be with a human being. And that's where he goes deeper than Kant. He is in the line of Kant, but he will then develop much more, with much more detail, what does it mean to enter in a relationship with this sacred entity, right? And of course, the I will talk about briefly. This is the relationship with yourself. So everything, this is the narcissistic relationship. This is agathon. Everything revolves around the self. I. There's not even an it, because everything simply revolves around the self. And we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, any questions on anything that I said? All right. Let me stop the recording.